Hi everyone, this is the second part of the Decolonial Methodologies speaker series, where we talk to Exeter English alumni about locating and utilising decolonial methods in their undergraduate or MA dissertations. I know that right now a lot of English undergraduates are currently going through their first dissertation meetings, sorting out what approach they're going to take with the texts, and I hope that this video will be helpful in your research journey at this point. The first part of the series, which you can also find on this channel, we spoke to Fatima about her work on archives and oral history in a South Asian context, which is what she works on. It is also important to remember, however, that the thinking decolonially is a process that can enrich any academic research that you're doing, regardless of which area or which period you're focusing specifically on. In essence, thinking about global power structures is not something exclusive to a post-colonial approach, but rather something that has a place in several contexts. On that note, for this session we have Bill Driscoll and Millie Creswell, both of them who did dissertation projects on travel literature and exploration. While Bill focused on travels in and around the Mughal Empire in the 17th century, Millie adopted a more contemporary approach, studying female self-fashioning and self-idealization on through hikes and trail hikes in the last few decades. Whilst their research on first glance seems to be connected only via the exploration and travel narrative aspect, considering that they're centuries and continents apart, both Bill and Millie looked at their research through a similarly decolonial lens, which according to them has actually improved their understanding of global exploratory trajectories found within these individualist and individualizing narratives. Of course, this would be a lot better in their words. So Bill and Millie, could you quickly just introduce yourself and your projects?
Hi Aneha, thanks for inviting me along to this talk. Just to introduce myself, my name is Bill Driscoll. I am a MA student at the University of Exeter, currently studying English Literary Studies, Renaissance Studies pathway. My work primarily focuses on travel accounts of the 17th century, with a little bit of bleeding either side into the 16th and 18th centuries. I mainly look at the authors themselves and their representations of self and subjectivity within their work. I take quite an identitarian approach to these travel accounts. My current project is my dissertation, which I'm just about to finish, which is entitled "It is Possible I Have Imbibed an Indian Taste: Ego, Alienation and Mediation in the Works of Nicolau Manucci and Francois Bernier."
Hi, my name's Millie and I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on through hiking and how this in contemporary travel writing links to decolonisation, colonisation and the formation of identity. So my dissertation title was Metal Frames and Trail Names, Exploring Identity Formation on Through Hikes. I focused on two texts, Wild by Cheryl Strayed and Tracks by Robin Davies. Through hikes are long, physically and demanding hikes. So my dissertation focused on how one through hike, which is long established and repopularised by Cheryl Strayed, the Pacific Crest Trail, and Robin Davies' hike across the Australian desert to reach the Indian Ocean. It was split into three sections, so community formations on the trail, how different interactions with different groups help form this isolated identity, which then leads back into everyday life. It then focused on constructions of national identity and how this also interacts with the natural spaces where you are walking. And the final section was gender on the trails and how this is actually a colonised perspective and how identity is always at its heart a relationship between land, space and power.
Thank you so much, guys. Now, the first question is for Millie. So, Millie, could you just take us through the connection that you made between contemporary travel narratives, specifically narratives of through hiking trails, and colonialism? Now, would you say you approached it through questions of land ownership or questions of what the wilderness actually means? And what do you think is the importance of being cogent and aware of decoloniality in the type of eco-criticism that you're working on?
So contemporary travel writing offers a really interesting perspective to explore colonisation and decolonisation, as you can explore how these early formations of colonised spaces, such as the Australian wilderness or outback, form a national identity. Concepts of the nation are described as a system of ideas and signs and associations and ways of behaving and communicating. So in Australia, a newly forming nation, identity formation is very explicit in the presentation of the population, from day-to-day language to formations of the states and territories and their boundaries. Davies' hike takes place in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, two of the places with the lowest population but strongest associations culturally to Aboriginal Australia. The wilderness remains an own space controlled by the government. Eco-criticism and colonialism are so entwined, especially in Australia. To Davies, the space is seen as empty, and she initiates a form of recolonisation as she views herself as owning and overpowering the land and animals around her. She trains camels, which are a non-native species to Australia, but again, Australia exports the highest number of camels globally. They have been forced onto the land and forced to adapt to the conditions that aren't necessarily what they are evolved to. Australian identity is very immersed in a national identity, formed in opposition to the outback as part of conquering it. This is formed from early settler narratives of trying to colonise the land by planting English and European herbs and flowers, which are often failed but sometimes succeeded, and this mirrors the domination and massacre of Indigenous people which is ongoing in Australia. This can be seen from riots in the 80s, 90s, even to protests that occur today, as well as the highest level of incarceration for Indigenous people, despite a low level of crime in comparison to white populations. In looking at comparisons to how Aboriginal people, notably Mr. Eddie, are presented in tracks, he teaches Davies how to work with the land, how to chew tobacco plants for nicotine, find water and edible plants. These comparisons to the white settlers within tracks are very different. Mr. Eddie is presented as a noble savage, a very problematic view, and looking at the decolonisation and the colonial methods that are used to portray Mr. Eddie is vital into understanding how Australian identity is formed. It is very much formed in opposition to Aboriginal people as they are associated with the land which settlers sought to dominate. It allows one to fully understand how political relationships are to the land, and that is why looking at eco-criticism is vital. Regardless of where the narrative is, Davies goes from Alice Springs, an urban centre within the outback, to these vast open spaces, and yet the narratives do not change. There are still colonial and imperial methods in place that Davies herself is not aware of.
Thank you so much, Millie. Now that's actually a really good segue into the question I had for Bill, actually. So Millie has put to us really well how she took an interthematic approach of eco-criticism, post-colonialism and feminism in order to interrogate the complexity of what is known as wilderness. So Bill, in your work then, how did you situate the decolonial in ways that did not seem immediately obvious? And by that I mean that when you talk of travel writing in the 17th and 18th century, the colonial aspect of these explorations are often implicitly and sometimes perfunctorily acknowledged. Could you then tell us how you took on the coloniality and the Orientalist perspective as a primary lens instead of as a side note or as something you acknowledged in your work?
That's a really great question, Naya. Thank you. I think we have to start by challenging the idea that it is a colonial pursuit, hard and fast at least. The Mughal Empire in the 17th century is a powerful and wealthy state, far more wealthy than than Louis XIV, for instance. The French calling it the trou d'argent, which translates as abyss of money. And this characterises so much of the relations between Europeans and the Mughals in the 17th century. I suppose, though, we can apply coloniality, or we can say that Bernier does arrive in India with a colonial mindset. He arrives as a vassal of a salon in Paris, which is interested in Mughal artifacts and culture. And we can apply, I guess, some kind of Saidian discourse here to say that, in wanting to know the other or the Orient can also mean gaining power over it, knowledge equaling power. But that's exactly what Bernier finds is incredibly difficult to gain. It's incredibly difficult to gain that knowledge. India, or the Mughals, the Mughal Empire is represented as an incredibly opaque and unforgiving environment for a European to be within. And so whilst he starts his narrative by saying, I wish to relay facts and occurrences so that my account will be less incorrect than others that I have seen, sort of trying to indicate that indicating that he wants to be another stratum of perception for the salon back home, as they begin to hone their idea of India and sharpen their focus. Yet at times during his narrative, he will say, I can't verify this account. I'm sorry, I can't verify it. I gained this information through intrigue and subterfuge. I bribed people for information to gain this. And it really begins to show how murky India is. This is all within the court as well. It's all sort of backdoor deals, and sort of you can imagine it as in quite a stylized way, I'm sure. But I think it shows really how disempowered Bernier is, and there are many other instances I could talk about, but that one, just for instance, is that he is so disempowered and so unable to verify accounts that he comes across, and almost becomes implicated in those sort of murky deals himself. He is engaging in subterfuge and bribery to gain that. So, in some ways, Bernier cannot rely on on a racial identity as a European in order to gain information, in order to know the other. In some ways, he becomes the other himself in order to get information that even then he isn't able to verify.
Thank you so much, Bill. Now we're going to go back to the beginning here and talk a bit about how thinking of literature through questions of power, questions of land, and questions of ownership, how that actually enriches your research and your appreciation of the work. So Millie, I'm going to be a wee bit blunt here. It is often a perspective that research on these feminist individualist narratives remains valid without an interrogation of whiteness, of colonialism, and that thinking of whiteness and thinking of colonialism in these narratives actually comes secondary. So I'm just going to ask you then, how did working with these factors actually benefit the depth of your work?
So working decolonial interrogations into my work opened up a whole new avenue of analysis. It allowed me to explore how our identity is formed not only in relation to the land, but to the politics of the land. I was able to deconstruct Strade's conception of femininity. On the hike, she is constantly discussing her female body and how that is impacted by the wilderness. It makes her stronger, it makes her tougher, and it takes away some of the femininity that she originally prizes. Her femininity and her concept of feminism is not intersectional, it is strictly that for the Western white woman. With Davies, looking at decolonial methods, exposed the Ned Kelly myth, which is posited by Huggin, and it demonstrates the ideological processes by which social memory may be reworked into the fabric of a nation's founding cultural myths. This is one way in which opening up colonial critiques expanded my analysis. I was able to see the frontier as a space which is viewed as somewhere to be colonised, and this informed much of my analysis of the novel. Colonial ideologies are also intertwined with structures of gender, as I said before. As explained by the master model, proposed by Lynch, exclusion creates a correlation of the other and nature. Lynch observes that native ecology is implicitly denigrated as the settler imaginary that functions in tandem with the more overt gestures of conquest participated in by men. National imagery in Australian colonial history therefore prizes the male conquering of the arid landscape rather than the preservation of indigenous species. And Davidson partakes in this imagery through using camels and taming them. She aligns femininity with the animals later on, and she exerts violence on them. She says in one point, "I hated myself for my infernal cowardice in dealing with people. It is such a female syndrome, so much the weakness of animals who have always been prey. I have not been aggressive or stood up to him enough." Here Davidson is prizing the masculine trait of aggression, one which she attains after living in the outback. This demonstrates not only how gender is built into national narratives surrounding wilderness, but how also this reenacts a colonial impact of having to dominate and control the other.
Thank you so much, Millie. That was fantastic. Now I'm going to switch up again and talk to Bill about period literature. So increasingly, there is talk about pre-1700s literature being, and as I quote, male, stale and pale. So I think that this could perhaps be because often literature from that period is often seen as from a Western perspective, where the West is home and elsewhere is elsewhere. And this often happens regardless of whether in the research imperialism is mentioned or not. So then could you talk to us about the fluidity of global travel narratives from that time period, and how you can focus on trajectories without necessarily emphasizing a singular trajectory outwards from the West?
I think it's Patricia Fumerton in her book Unsettled who says that the early modern subject, or the early modern travelling subject, so to speak, has no empowering place. And I think it's her linkages of place to power that are really pertinent to early modern travel writing studies. As soon as the early modern subject moves outside of its locality, suddenly it is unable to recourse to, say, power dynamics or shared values that exist within that space. Fumerton's mainly talking about vagrants who move within England, so domestic travel. But I think those ideas can be easily transposed into a global context. That on the global stage, the power of the European in the early modern period is extremely diluted. If we take, for instance, Bernier, another instance that he goes through is when he is accosted by bandits on the lonely road. And he is unable to, he's got no power as a European, and he does not seem to try to even sort of say, well, I'm European, you can't touch me. But instead he makes a grand display of his abilities as a physician. He hides his money rather scrupulously amongst himself, and he's terrified of being robbed and left for dead. But the whole performance shows that he is unable to, that in being unable to rely upon his racial qualities, he has to come up with a new identity, a new presentation of himself that's rather intrepid and daring. And interestingly, he doesn't want to relay this information. He's reluctant to relay this information to his readers in his travels, in the travels that he writes. And he says, "I fear I would tire my readers if I gave you, an account of what happened. But then he does give an albeit truncated account, but he does go on to give an account. And I think it shows how, on the one hand, he's reluctant to reveal that he was so radically disempowered in this moment, that he was entirely subjugated by India as a place and a space, and by its people. But he also wants to show off and sort of really vaunt his new identity that's so estranged from Europe, that because he is disempowered from Europe, he's able to formulate a new identity that is far more intrepid and daring. And that comes about, I would argue, through an estrangement from place, or through the movement and modulation of space within the early modern traveller, in this case Bernier. And I think that really and I think Fumerton's comments show how all of these things, especially land and power, how they impinge upon the early modern subject when they travel.
Thank you so much, both of you, for speaking to us today. Now, just to quickly wrap up, a lot of what Millie and Bill had to say aligns with W.D. Mignolo's conception of diversality, which comes as an alternative to the softer, more liberalised universality. As such, thinking decolonially is not taking anything away from your research, but actually offering you an opportunity to confront capitalism, to confront industrialism from an equalizing, eco-critical standpoint. And this is something that can be expanded beyond travel narratives or eco-criticism, as you'll find that thinking critically about the relationship between people, land, sea, and power will always serve to enrich your work and open new possibilities and new pathways to interrogate the structures and the strictures that your work, that your chosen work is existing within. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today. So thank you so much to Bill and Millie for their time today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that this series is proving helpful in your research journey.